to drive a stick shift. Awesome. Cool. Thank you, William and Madeline, for not raising your hands. I did not grow up driving a stick shift. We had automatic cars, and so stick shifts were not in my experience. When I became a valet in college as a summer job, I had to learn to drive a stick shift in order to drive people's cars. And so I did, and I learned to drive all sorts of different kinds of stick shifts. Unfortunately, I actually got stuck in a parking garage one time because I couldn't find reverse. It was a sob, and it was a really weird place, and I got stuck. Anyway, that's a totally different story. But we were on a trip this summer, and we had to rent a car for a couple days. We mostly took trains and buses and boats and other things, but we had to rent a car for a couple days, and I reserved an automatic transmission car. They gave us a stick, and that's all they had left, because it was a busy season in the summer, which was fine because I could drive a stick, so that was fine. On one of the days, we decided that our venture of the day was to go on a hike. And it was a beautiful area, and we decided we want to go on the hike that's on the mountain so we can see, have a good view of the whole area where we are. So we decided, let's go on this hike. It was about 30 minutes or so of a drive, and it was beautiful. I mean, we drove up and over some hills and then down into a valley and wound around the valley for a while and then started winding up through some really cute towns, and it was just beautiful. Once we got out of the couple towns, the road started getting a little windier as you got up toward the trailhead. And we had read a description about the road. And it said, fair warning, it said, the road gets extremely narrow. We thought, okay. So we're driving up the road. We did a U-turn, hairpin turn, and we looked up the road, and it was narrow. It was really narrow. And all of a sudden I started thinking, how am I going to turn around up there? If I have to stop, am I going to roll? Because I'm not an expert stick shift driver. I don't know what I'm going to do. So we made a very quick decision. Let's stop, park, and walk. I did not have what I needed to be able to continue driving confidently. We often need things to continue believing confidently. Because a lot of times when we believe things, we need to grow our beliefs, we need to strengthen our beliefs, we need to support our beliefs, we need to prop up our beliefs. Believing for a moment doesn't guarantee a lifetime of believing. We have to keep strengthening our beliefs for our beliefs to continue. When it comes to Jesus and believing in Jesus, what do we need to keep on believing? And what's the result of our beliefs? What happens because we believe? By now, I think we all know where in the Bible we would turn to look for things having to do with believing. We've been at this for about 5 weeks or so now. So we know that the Gospel of John is the great way to go when it comes to belief. Because the cool thing about John, as we've seen, is of the 400-ish times that believing comes up in the Bible, John, just one book, has about 100 of these mentions of believing. He's got a quarter on the market when it comes to believing. It's all about believing. And more than the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke combined don't even match John. Believing is hugely important to John. So important, in fact, that he gives us ways of growing our beliefs. He helps us see what is it that we need in order to keep on believing. So what does John do? Well, John spends a lot of time, of course, talking about believing, but I appreciate how straightforward John is when he's talking about believing. He He doesn't hide behind issues. He doesn't mince words. He doesn't steer away from awkward conversations. He is clear. From the beginning, John has been telling a story. And his story is about Jesus. Quick summary, he starts with this great epic introduction. He jumps into Jesus, calling the disciples, Jesus healing, Jesus doing miracles, Jesus casting out demons, Jesus doing all kinds of things. Halfway through his book, he has spent time talking about 3 years of Jesus. The last half of his book is about 1 week of Jesus' life. So 3 years, it's like time totally slows down when we get to the second half. And he just focuses on all these epic events. Jesus is with the disciples. Jesus is arrested. Jesus is crucified. Jesus is raised from the dead. John gets to the end of the whole story. It's like he's finished everything he needs to say about Jesus. And then I love that John says, now I'm going to tell you why I wrote all this. I love when an author does that. Thank you for just being clear about it, for telling me, oh, this is what you meant to do. And this is what John writes about why he wrote the entire story about Jesus. Here's what he says. The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs, in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. Thank you, John. Thank you for being clear. You did not write this book as just an entertaining journey about some neat guy, although it is. Thank you, John, that you did not just tell history and document some events that happened in a certain time and place. Although, that's helpful. John, you told us that you wrote these specific, chosen, curated events so that we believe. Yeah. Believe in what? What does John say that he wrote these things and chose these things so that we believe? 2 things he says. We believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. When he talks about the Messiah, the Savior, he's talking about the person that had been promised by God for generations. The person that people had longed for, had hoped for, had dreamed of would come and had waited for. This person, a real-life human person who would come and change things and redeem them. The real human he's wanting us to believe in. And he's wanting us to believe in the Son of God, the chosen one, the one that God sent, the one that God commissioned to be able to go, the one who should be honored, just like people honor angels, and even God himself. That's the Son of God. He wants us to believe in the fullness of who Jesus is. The person who's just like you and me, who lived and breathed like us, and the divine child of God, who God said, I'm sending myself to you. Believe in all of that I sent. Just to get this straight, John put together all of these events about Jesus so that you and I could believe that Jesus was in fact the person that God sent, and God himself who came. Now, what does John mean by all this? Believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. We talk about oftentimes that we believe things are true. I believe that that's true. I believe that to be a true thing. Take the weather forecast, for example. The weather forecast was to be a sunny day today. And if we decided yesterday, it's going to be a sunny day, and I am going to believe the weather forecast. So, what do? We dress in certain ways. We make certain plans to do certain things because it's going to be sunny. We might adjust our blinds in a certain way because it's sunny. But if we chose not to believe that the weather forecast is true, then we might do other things. We might dress in completely different ways. We might plan totally different activities that we wouldn't do on a sunny day, we do on a cloudy day or a rainy day. We might stay inside more, get in our slippers and read a book or do other things because we didn't believe that the weather report was true. When we believe things, it impacts what we do. Our beliefs aren't meant to stay here, they're meant to go throughout us, to dictate our behavior, to change the things we do, to impact who we are, what we think, and what we do. That's what John is trying to get at as well. That believing in Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, isn't just something that I gotta get my mind around, and I've gotta figure out how can I understand that, but can I believe it so that it changes the way I talk, so it changes the way I act, so it dictates my schedule, so it impacts who I talk to and how I interact with others and everything that I do. John's goal is that it doesn't just stay here, it gets out further than us. And as we've looked at this whole idea of believing, I think by now we've probably seen that believing according to the Bible isn't just here, but believing is being so convinced of something that we begin to live that way. We've seen that that's how the Bible talks about believing. It even says this in Romans, a great way of describing this. It says, let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Changing the way we think is only part of it. Then we learn to know God's will, live God's will, do God's will. To know it intimately is to do it and act on it. That's part of believing and knowing and understanding. That's exactly what John is talking about. He's not talking about a moment of believing that doesn't last. He's talking about believing that continues. John is talking about believing that endures, that sustains. Through good times, challenges, questions, issues, problems, good times, celebrations, everything. Who of us does not want a belief that doesn't endure? I mean, we don't believe something just to quit. We believe something because we want it to last, because we're excited about it, because it's going to change something. And John chooses to give us things that we need in order to keep on believing. Jesus' life, Jesus' experiences, what Jesus taught, what Jesus talked about, how Jesus acted, how Jesus interacted with people. Filling ourselves with Jesus helps us keep on believing. Remember how we've talked about John before, that he has kind of a corner on this whole believing idea. He talks about it a lot. He does, but there's something similar he never talks about. He never brings up the word belief, the thing, the noun, the commodity. He only talks about believing, the action. It's like he's not as concerned about the thing as he is about what we do. And it comes out loud and clear in his book. What we do because of who Jesus is and who God sent, that's what matters. And as we fill ourselves with Jesus, that helps us keep on believing. Fill ourselves with his words, fill ourselves with his Bible, fill ourselves with conversation about Jesus, fill ourselves with connecting who Jesus is with the things that are happening in life. Fill ourselves with Jesus' wisdom for how do I get through this and what do I do with that. Fill ourselves with Jesus helps us keep on believing. There's more in John's short phrase toward the end of his book. Don't get me wrong, what we do, of course, is quite important. It's very important. Jesus is fully invested in our lives here, but there's something more that's connected to our life here, and even more than that. Remember what John said, that these things are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. What kind of life is he talking about? Is he talking about, if you believe in Jesus, things are going to go really good for you tomorrow? Like, no problems, no issues, No disagreements, no suffering. Is that what he's talking about? Okay, good, because we all know he's not. You know, we try to follow Jesus, and we still have pain and suffering and challenge and arguments and problems and issues. It just happens. He can't just be talking about that. Is he just talking about, you know what, someday you're going to have a free pass to heaven. It's going to be great. Sort of. But there's a little bit more than that. When we talk about life, when we say life, we have one word, and it means everything. When we say life, it means my heart is working and my lungs are working and I'm alive. It means that I'm thinking and pondering about the meaning of life. It means those sugar-coated cereal squares that you eat out of a bowl. Life. Cereal. I mean, there's all kinds. Really? I eat life. I eat cinnamon life. But John, though, he's got an advantage. He has 3 words to talk about life. First is bios. We kind of can imagine, we get biology, we get biosphere, we get all these bio sorts of words, and we know that has to do with physical, me, you, air, breathe, mountains, carbon dioxide, life that's here and now. He also could choose this other word. We can imagine what this relates to. Suke relates to psychology and psychosis and psychotic and psychic, and that has to do with our minds and how we think about life. It's more mental, it's more imaginative, it's up here. But it also has a word, zoe. That has to do with life as God gives it to us. It's a life that we don't completely understand. It's a life that's now and beyond. And this is by far the most common kind of life that's talked about in the Bible, specifically in the New Testament, and even more specifically in John. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have Zoe.
Wow.
I am the way, the truth, and the Zoe.
Wow.
I have come that they may have Zoe and have it abundantly. And over and over again, Jesus is talking about Zoe, like the life that God gives. That's what John is describing here. That when we keep on believing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, then we get to discover this Zoe. It's not a ticket. It's not a free pass to something then. It's now and then. When Jesus was talking about bringing God's kingdom here, Jesus was inaugurating God's kingdom. He was talking about God is starting this Zoe now. It's not just in the future someday, it is right now. So when John is talking about believe this, he's not talking about because then someday things are going to be good, but just now it's going to be a mess. He's saying this life starts now and continues forever because it's God's gift for us. Believing lets us live the way God made us to live. There are all kinds of other brands of life out there, but this is God's brand of life for us. If this whole believing thing wasn't that big of a deal, I don't know why John would have gone to so much trouble to stack his book with believing, to describe it in the way that he does, and to choose all these events of Jesus that are designed for us to be able to keep on believing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. With believing, there's a promise of life now and life forever, the way God made us to live. I mentioned earlier that I worked in the ballet. The promise of a valet is a good tip. Valets always talked about their tips. Which cars gave good tips, which cars gave mediocre tips. And you can imagine, it was usually the fancy cars that they looked at and said, well, that's a good tip car. And the other drives up and they think, oh, I'm not going to worry about that one, you can have that car, because they're not a good tip car. And so we would always categorize the cars, and that's just what we talked about. It was terrible, but that's what we did. So, because everybody hopes that there's a good tip in the next car that comes. So, the fancy car comes and everybody swarms around it, and the normal one comes and people ignore it. I was working at a steakhouse restaurant on my own one night as a valet, and it was late. There were only a few cars left. It had been a while since another person had come out, and so I pulled the several cars that were left. I just pulled them up to where I was in the front. I mean, there's no sense in making people wait or making me run around. I'm like, let's get home. So when they came out of the restaurant, it was quick. They could get their keys, they could drive off. So I remember the first group that came out had some nice-ish car. I can't remember what it was. They handed them the keys, gave a tip, got in the car, drove off. Next person came out, some kind of sports car, can't remember, but it was a sports car. He tipped, got in, and left. The last couple came out, and they got in their two-door red Honda Prelude. I mean, I think two-door cars are cool, but it's a Honda Prelude. I mean, it's not like it's a Rolls Royce. So they came out, and I gave them the keys, and they tipped me, and they drove off. As I'm going back, it was the biggest tip I ever got.
Wow.
Ever.
Wow.
John's tip is believe that Jesus is the Savior. God's sent Son. Because then you get to discover the life that God made for us to be able to live. Pray with me, please.